Today's daf is daf Lamed Dalid, and the Gemara asks the following question: Velukma bechulin shenasu al taras truma, meaning, why was it necessary to interpret our Mishnah as going against Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Yeshua, after all, does have a case of a shlishi, meaning that chulin could become a shlishi in a case of chulin shenasu al taras truma. And the Gemara says, Lo sal kedaitach. You cannot fit that into our Mishnah, the katani basar. Right? Our Mishnah is talking about shchita of an animal, the basar, and there's no such thing as nasu altaros truma with regard to basar. Deibit truma basar mi'ika. Right? Truma comes from grains and fruits and anything that grows from the ground, not from basar. Basar could never be truma. So this whole idea of institutionalizing a Kabbalah, if somebody accepts upon himself that he'll treat chulin as if it were truma, and the Rabbanon, as I said before, institutionalized that. They gave it a geshpanka, they gave it a significance and recognized that Kabbalah as binding. That's only with regard to something that could be confused with truma. But basar could never be confused with truma. Obviously, people know the difference between basar and truma. So if you're talking about altaras truma in the case of grains, for example, even though these grains of chulin, he's going to treat it like as if it were truma with kedushas truma. That makes sense because he doesn't want to be mitame truma. And if you allow him to be metame chulin that could become truma, meaning they're the same min as truma, then we could say, okay, then we're going to treat the chulin as if it were truma, and therefore it's tame. And you could have a shlishi in chulin, but not in the case of basar. So now the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. If your logic is such, and therefore our Mishnah is talking about kodshim and not truma, elamai bekodshim. So you're talking about chulin shenasu altaras hakodesh b'chaya bekodshim ika. After all, our Mishnah is dealing not only with behema, which could become a korban, but it's also dealing with a chaya, and there's no such thing as a chaya that could become kodshim. There's not one single korban that's brought from a chaya. So what are you going to say? That somebody would treat his basar of chaya as if it were chulin b'taras hakodesh? That doesn't make any sense. How could you consider it as tuma b'taras hakodesh? As chulin b'taras hakodesh when you're dealing with a chaya? Rabbi, I have to tell you the truth. The answer is obvious to this question. Because again, we're worried about confusing that which is chulin with that which is kodesh. So in the case of chaya, who knows the difference between the meat of a chaya and the meat of a behema? And that's, I think, what the Gemara is going to answer now. Basa be-basa michlef, basa be-peri lo michlef. No one would institute an acceptance of chulin betara al-taras hatruma in a case of basar, because there's no possibility of making a mistake and confusing basar with peros or basar with dagon. But in the case of chaya, if he accepted upon himself to treat the chulin of a chaya al taras hakodesh, you could definitely imagine that he would confuse that with basar behema, because basar chaya and basar behema look identical. So the bottom line at this point, before we go on to Ula, is that the Mishnah cannot be referring to Chullin shenasu al taras truma because we're dealing with basar. And therefore, by process of elimination, if you want to interpret our Mishnah as referring to truma, to chulin hanasa al taras something, it can't be taras truma, it can only be taras kodesh. And if you'll ask me, well, why chaya? The answer is because basa michlad. Now the Gemara is going to make an attempt to reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yoshua. And the premise is that Mishnah is definitely referring to Chullin because we had in yesterday's daf many, many proofs that it cannot be referring to Kodshim. So let's just quickly review the diuk in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you shecht an animal and no dam comes out, so therefore the basar is not muksha lekabel tumah, therefore you're allowed to touch the meat with shnios, meaning with yadayim avos, which are considered shnios letuma. Because chulin can't become shlishi in a case where there was no machshir, there was no dam. And the implication is that if there would be dam, which would be one of the sheva mashkim that is machshir lekabel tumah, then you cannot handle this meat with yadayim misoavos, which are shnios, because the chulin will become a shlishi. So let's see if there's any way of reconciling that with Rabbi Yeshua. Omar Ula. Now, Ula is going to quote Chevraya as one opinion, and according to that opinion, you cannot reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yeshua. But Ula himself is going to disagree with Chevraya, and according to Ula, we have an opening to reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yeshua. Chevraya Amrin bechulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. That our Mishnah, and again we have already established it's dealing with chulin, but why in a case where there was hechsher would chulin be subject to a shlishi letuma, so that we can justify why you're not allowed to touch it with yadayim misoavos at shnios? And the answer is because he accepted upon himself to eat this chulin al taras hakodesh. And that's against Rabbi Yoshua. Now, the reason why that's against Rabbi Yoshua is because presumably Rabbi Yoshua limits his definition or his accepting that chulin can become a shlishi only to the case of altaras truma, but not altaras hakodesh. However, va'noa amina, I, Ula, disagree with Chevraya, and I am of the opinion that Rabbi Yeshua, we can reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yeshua, because when Rabbi Yeshua said that Chulin could become a shlishi when he accepted upon himself al taras truma, he didn't mean only taras hatruma, but he meant even taras hatruma. But how much more so if he accepted upon himself al taras kodesh, because kodesh is more chamur in dinei tuma than truma. And therefore, we're going to apply the Talmudic phrase or concept of lo miboy. Lo miboy means that when Rabbi Yeshua meant al taras, when he said al taras truma, he meant, it goes without saying al taras hakodesh. Lo miboy ka'amar lo miboy chulin shenas al taras hakodesh. The chamiri, so we therefore understand that if he accepted upon himself to treat the chulin as if it was kodesh, then certainly we can understand why chulin can become a shlishi. The ispe shlishi, Ella, what Rabbi Yeshua wanted to say was, I want to go a step further, according to Ula's interpretation. Afilu chulin shenas al taras truma, which again has a lower standard of tuma. For example, Kodesh could become a Revi Lituma. In Truma, there's no such thing as a Revi Lituma. The maximum of level of Tuma that would passel Truma is Shlishi. There's no Revi. Is Nami Ispahu Shlishi. So therefore, since there is a level of Tuma of Shlishi with regard to Truma, therefore, Rabbi Yeshua told us the more novel Chidush that even if he accepted Chullin Altaras Truma, that would still allow for Chullin to become a Shlishi, because it could be confused with Truma. And Truma lends itself to a psul of Shlishi. But how much more so if he accepted upon himself Chullin Altaras Kodesh, where, as we said before, there's even a Revi L'Tuma, how much more so would Shlishi become Tomei? You know, you treat the Chullin as if it were Kodesh, and certainly, therefore, there should be a Shlishi in Chullin. So again, going back to our Mishnah in Yadayim Misu Avos, which is a Sheni, when it comes in contact with the meat after the dam comes out, and therefore the meat becomes Mukshal L'Kabel Tumah, then you're not allowed to come in contact with the meat, because that would make the meat into a Shlishi. And even Rabbi Yeshua would accept in the case where he accepted upon himself Altaras HaKodesh, or even Altaras HaTruma, there would be a Shlishi in Chullin. So we can reconcile, says Ula, Rabbi Yeshua with our Mishnah. Man Chevraya, can we identify this group of Amoraim that understood that Rabbi Yeshua was only talking about Taras Truma, but not Taras Kodesh? Rabbi Baruch Hanahi. It's Rabbi Baruch Hana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, in what context did Rabbi Yochanan make this statement and this interpretation of Rabbi Yeshua as referring to Taras Truma, not Taras Kodesh, which again would have no bearing on our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is talking about Basar, and there's no Taras Truma in Basar. So the context in which Rabbi Yochanan made this statement was the Masa Matan, the back and forth between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Maya Hadri Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua Ladodi. What was this discussion back and forth, what we call Shaklavitaria, between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? Now, just to remind ourselves of what we did yesterday, Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that if somebody eats ochel tameh, and again, there could be different levels of tumah, it could be a rishon, it could be a sheni, it could be a shlishi, and so forth, then the ochel takes on the same identical status as the ochel. The ochel is like the ochel. So that would mean, let's say, for example, if the ochel was sheni, then the ochel would become a sheni. And Rabbi Yeshua disagrees, although it's only a partial disagreement, because although Rabbi Yeshua, in the case of an ochel rishon, would say, right, the ochel is a rishon, would say that the ochel becomes a sheni, and it goes down one level, But with regard to a sheni, if the ochel is a sheni, like let's say, for example, a sheretz falls into a kli cheres, and there's also ochel in it, that ochel is a sheni, and now somebody eats that sheni, Rabbi Yeshua says that he's a sheni. And if it was a rishon, then he becomes a sheni. So Amalo Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Matzinu ochel chomer mina ochel. How can you possibly say that if the ochel is a rishon, then the ochel becomes a sheni and it goes down in madriga? After all, we have a source in the Torah that ochel chomer mina ochel. Ochel, the one who eats the tumah, is more chamur than the ochel itself, which is a pella when you think about it, that you ate something that had a lower level of tumah, and you, by virtue of your eating it, you jack up the level of tumah. And where do we find such a thing? This is the halacha of that we've touched upon many times, nevelas of tar. So if an of tar dies without shchita, is tar bachutz. If let's say somebody touches the carcass of an of tahar that died without shchita, it's an avela, he does not contract tumah. Lo metam. Ve'ilu ochla, but when he eats it, and by the way, he could eat it in a way that he doesn't even come in contact with it with his hands because somebody puts it into his mouth, is metame b'godim ha'beis habliya. Right? If he eats enough of the nevelas of tar, then the moment it goes into his beis habliya, like, down his throat, at that point, he's metame even his begodim. And this is a doraisa halacha. So we see how machmir the Torah is with regard to an ochel, one who eats tumah. Why is that? Because in maga, the tumah of the of nevela, the nevela of Torah, would not contaminate his begodim. But when he eats it, it's metame his begodim beis habliya. So if the Torah goes ahead and sets a precedent where the ochel is more chomer in his level of tumah than the machal itself, which was the nevela, hechlo nasa ochel kamachal. At least you got to grant me that the ochel is at least on the same level as the ochel itself, as the food. And therefore, if the food is a rishon, then the ochel should become a rishon. And Rabbi Yeshua was the one who said that if the food is a rishon, the ochel becomes a sheni, and we go down a level. Rabbi Yeshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer's argument, and he says, we have a principle in Shas, we'll have it later on in Chullin with regard to Basa B'Cholov, that something that's a chidush, in other words, when the Torah establishes a law that defies all the rules of the halach itself, then we don't derive any conclusions from that. We can't expand it, and there's no such thing as an analogy. So that oftar, when it becomes an avela and it's metame bebeis habliya, the begodim that he's wearing, that defies all the halachas that we know, because there's something called, just one second, what's it called? Beis hastarim, meaning tumah is not conveyed in a private place, something that's not visible to the eye. And yet, nevelas of tahar in Beis Habliya is tumas Beis Hastarim, because it's only metame the person has begotten when it goes down his throat. So that undermines and defies all the regulations of Kabbalah's Tumah. So don't prove anything from the Velas of Tar that the Ochel is more chomer than the Ochel itself. And on the contrary, Adarabah, Motzinu Shamachel chomer min Ochel, that the food itself has a higher and more intense level of Tumah than the Ochel, with regard to Shiurim. In other words, what's the minimum size of an Ochel that once it's Makabel Tumah, it could pass on and transmit that Tumah to something else? All we need is that the Ochel be the size of a kibetza. But when it comes to the Ochel is concerned, he will only become Tomei if he eats a pras. A pras is 2 beitzim. So we see Dilu Machol Kibetza the Ochel Kichatzi Pras. Oh, I'm sorry, I called it a pras. I meant to say a Chatzi Pras, which is equivalent to the volume of 2 eggs. So we see here that the Torah is more machmir with regard to the Machol. So the Machol, if it's a Kibetza, will be contaminated, and then it will transmit that Tumah, even though it's only the size of a kibetza, whereas, as far as the ochel is concerned, he does not contract tumah unless he eats foodstuff that has the shear of a chatzi pras, which is 2 beitzim. V'yonu heich nasa ochel kemachal. How could you therefore tell me that the ochel has the same din, the same status as the machal, and therefore if the machal is a rishon, the ochel becomes a rishon? On the contrary, you see that the Torah, with regard to the machal, goes down a level, right? The ochel is only contaminated if he eats 2 beitzim, which is a chatzi pras. So now the Gemara flips it back to Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer holds that on the contrary, the ochel is more chomer than the machal, as we saw from nevelas of tameh, and he wants to say that at the very least, the ochel should have the same status as the machal, and a rishon becomes a rishon. But here we see clearly from the halach of shiurim that the Torah is more lenient with regard to the ochel. Rabbi Eliezer tu mishurim lo gamrinon. The laws of Tumah are not to be determined by shiurim. Shiurim is a separate entity. The measure of tamei food required to contaminate, etc., that has nothing to do with it. Those are special halachas of measures. Okay, let's go on. Now, Rabbi Eliezer puts forward another challenge to Rabbi Yoshua. V'od lidvarecha, if you're telling me, according to your logic, that the ochel is less stringent than the machal, and therefore if he eats a rishon, it becomes a sheni on the lower level, then you should be consistent. Lidvarecha shata omer al rishon sheni yafa ta omer, fine. But sheni lama, why is it that you admit that if the ochel is a sheni, then the ochel becomes a sheni? According to you, he should become a shlishi. Omalo, matzinu shasheni osa sheni al yidei mashkin. So Yeshua now says there's a precedent. A precedent to the halachic rule that the ochel becomes a sheni when the machal is a sheni. And how is that? Through what I call an agency. In modern Hebrew, I'd call it a mitavech. If you have middle person. So what happens now? A machal sheni comes in contact with liquids, with mashkim. The mashkim have a special halacha that when mashkim come in contact with a rishon letuma, a solid foodstuff that's a rishon, when the mashkim come in contact with a solid food that's a sheni letuma, the mashkim become a rishon letuma. It's like a mind-boggling halacha. And again, on the side, there's like a footnote. If you want to know why the Torah and the Rabbanan are more machmir in liquids, it's because liquids don't require machshirim. Solids are not makabel tumah unless there's a machshir, one of the 7 liquids. But the liquids don't require machshir. They themselves are machshir themselves. So the Torah is more machmir in liquids. So this liquid came in contact with a sheni l'tumah and it becomes a rishon l'tumah. And now, if somebody drinks that liquid, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. So we started with the sheni l'tumah, which was the ochel that came in contact with the mashke. The mashke now comes in contact with an ochel, and that ochel, that second ochel that came in contact with the mashke, now becomes a sheni l'tumah. Again, I don't feel that comfortable with the logic and the analysis of Rav Yeshua, because here there's a mitavech, there's someone in the middle, and that's the liquids. The liquids were a rishon l'tumah. So that makes perfect sense that if the liquids transmit tumah to a solid, the solid becomes a sheni l'tumah. You'll ask me, but we started with the sheni l'tumah. It doesn't matter, but we went through a middle stage in which the ochel was matami mashkin, and it went up a madrega, up a level to a rishon l'tumah. Omar lo, v'ha mashkin nami tchilav. What kind of proof do you bring from ochel to mashke and mashke to ochel when the mashke in the middle is a rishon? It's called tchila. Tchila means a rishon. Disnan, we learned in a Mishnah Masechta Para, kol aposel betruma, mitami mashkin lios tchila. Now, what's a posel betruma? Let's take a minute of time to explain what the word posel means when it comes to truma. Normally, when you use the word tameh, like let's say, for example, if I were to say, which this is incorrect, if I were to say that a sheni that comes in contact with truma makes the truma tameh, that's not correct. Why? Because the word tameh in halachic lexicon means that it could transmit tumah. Now, truma could become pasul when it becomes a shlishi l'tumah, but it cannot create a revi l'tumah. So that's why we use the word pasul, that if a sheni came in contact with truma, he pasels the truma, posel et truma. He doesn't convey tumah, although again, shlishi l'tumah is tameh, and therefore it's possible, but it's not real tumah, because real, genuine tumah means that you can transmit the tumah, which is not applicable in the case of a shlishi of truma. And in the case of mashkim that come in contact with a sheni l'tumah, the tumah of the mashke gets upgraded to the status of a rishon l'tumah, tchilas tumah. Chutz mi Tvul Yom. We're more mekil in a Tvul Yom, because a Tvul Yom, keep in mind, has already gone to the mikveh. So his state of tumah is already partially reduced, if you will, lowered down, simmered down, until Hariv Shemesh. We have to wait till the sun sets, like the first Mishnah in Shas. So again, what Rabbi Eliezer's counter argument to Rabbi Yeshua is that Since the mashkin in the middle becomes a rishon l'tumah, it makes sense that when the mashkin comes in contact with another foodstuff, it makes that foodstuff into a sheni l'tumah. The Ode, a further argument of Rabbi Eliezer against Rabbi Yeshua, shlishi sheni lama. Let's say you ate a shlishi, and Rabbi Yeshua says, if you eat a shlishi, then you become a sheni, which means that you're metame kodesh. So you yourself, Rabbi Yeshua, have set the bar, have set a precedent in which a shlishi, once it's eaten, generates the status of a sheni. Now, your argument is that we go from Rishon to Sheni. Okay, Sheni to Sheni is the exception to the rule based on the, that intervening liquids. But as a general rule, you, Rabbi Yeshua, maintain that we go down a level. So why is it that Shlishi Sheni, that if you eat a Shlishi, you become a Sheni? You yourself now have basically conceded that the Ochel is worse than the Machal. Omalo. So on this last argument, we find the counter argument of Yeshua. I don't know about the previous argument. That I don't know. But anyway, he says, Afani lo amarti ella bitruma. When I said that if you eat a shlishi, you become a sheni, that's only because you accepted upon yourself that Chullin should be altaras truma. Now, if you're saying altaras truma, then you don't want to confuse it with a sheni. Because a shlishi, as we said before, is not tameh in truma. It's only pasul. Shetar rasa, and here we turn to Amid Beis, tumahi etzel kodesh.